You know Jack Kerouac as the romantic poet of America's highways, but here's what they don't teach in literature class. He was also one of the most resentful writers of his generation. Let's talk about the people he couldn't forgive. For over 2 decades, Jack's novels like On the Road introduced America to the beat philosophy, his stream of consciousness writing capturing the wild energy of jazz, romance, and spiritual seeking. But when the typewriter went silent and the loneliness crept in, Kerouac's idealism often curdled into bitterness. And according to those who knew him best, the road's greatest chronicler kept a mental list of people he considered complete phonies. In his final years, ravaged by alcohol and increasingly conservative politics, Kerouac became vocal about the figures he'd grown to loathe, creating painful rifts with old friends who couldn't understand how their prophet of freedom had become so angry and rigid. Truman Capote, the elite wordsmith Kerouac called a society climber. Truman Capote was literature's most notorious socialite, a razor-sharp novelist and screenwriter whose In Cold Blood revolutionized true crime writing. Capote's childhood was marked by devastating abandonment. His mother's severe mental health struggles led to her hospitalization, while his father vanished from his life entirely. His full name became Truman Garcia Capote, only after his mother remarried Joe Capote, who adopted the boy, but the emotional damage had already been done, creating the flamboyant persona he used as protection against lifelong fears of rejection. In private conversations, according to Kerouac's letters and interviews, Capote topped Jack's list of literary frauds. He's what happens when style completely overwhelms substance, Kerouac reportedly grumbled after Capote's infamous 1959 put-down. That's not writing, that's typing, dismissing On the Road as amateur work. Unlike other rivalries that stayed behind closed doors, Capote's sin was going public. He mocked Kerouac's spontaneous writing method on television, stoking Jack's fury. The bitter irony was that both men carried similar wounds: abandonment, parental loss, and the desperate search for acceptance. Yet Capote chose to climb into high society while Kerouac sought truth on America's highways. During a boozy 1960s party Kerouac crashed, he mimicked Capote's distinctive voice in a cruel parody, declaring, "That's not living, that's performing," leaving the room silent with shock. Jack couldn't stand being looked down on, a mutual friend recalled. Truman treated him like hired help, not a visionary. Capote's treatment of working-class people was allegedly cold, too. He'd dismiss common types at gatherings, once reportedly brushing off a fan as not worth my time, displaying the very class snobbery that had wounded him as a child. What enraged Kerouac most was the contrast between Capote's polished, carefully revised prose and Jack's raw, emotional outpourings. He'd parade his wealthy friends around, then trash real truth seekers, a Beat insider revealed. Capote's later struggles, including his partner Jack Dunphy's health issues and his own descent into alcoholism and prescription medication abuse in his final years, didn't soften Kerouac's opinion. Jack saw them as consequences for Capote's betrayal of authentic experience. When Capote passed away in 1984, Jack, already gone since 1969, had left notes calling him a serpent in designer clothes. Allen Ginsberg, the revolutionary poet, Kerouac branded a political sellout. On the surface, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac were inseparable, co-founding the Beat movement with epic collaborations like Howl, inspiring Jack's prose style. Ginsberg's ecstatic verse and activism made him a counterculture icon. Beneath the friendship, accounts from Kerouac's later years reveal deep resentment, placing Ginsberg high on his internal blacklist. "He's sold his soul to the radicals," Kerouac allegedly complained after their politics diverged. Jack turning toward conservative Catholicism, Ginsberg embracing far-left activism. What particularly irritated Jack was Allen's transformation from seeking personal spiritual enlightenment to pushing collective political action, evolving from a fellow seeker into what Kerouac saw as a propagandist who had abandoned the pure beat vision for trendy causes. The most shocking moment came during Kerouac's 1968 firing line appearance, where he showed up intoxicated and denounced Ginsberg as part of a Jewish communist conspiracy. "Ruining the beats," slurring, "Allen Ginsberg? He doesn't understand anything about anything." The studio audience grew uncomfortable as Jack rambled incoherently, nearly falling off his chair. Jack felt betrayed, a friend explained. Ginsberg pushed revolution, while Jack wanted spiritual peace. Ginsberg's openness about his romantic life also clashed with Kerouac's guilt-ridden bisexuality and Catholic shame. Allen would tease Jack about his romantic hang-ups and religious guilt, not understanding how deeply they tormented his friend. Despite Ginsberg's continued generosity toward Jack, funding his travels, promoting his work, and trying to maintain their friendship, even as Jack grew increasingly hostile, Kerouac saw him as a manipulator who was exploiting their shared history for political gain. In final letters, Jack wrote, "Allen's lost in madness." Their friendship crumbled, with Kerouac cutting off contact with Ginsberg before his 1969 passing. Which beat generation betrayal shocked you most? Share your thoughts on these literary feuds. Ed Sanders, the hippie rebel Kerouac, dismissed as a bearded faker. Ed Sanders, founder of the Fugs and Peace activist, crossed Kerouac's path on that infamous 1968 firing line episode. Sanders's satirical songs and anti-war stance embodied the hippie movement. Raised in Kansas City, Missouri, Sanders drew from American folk traditions, but dove headfirst into psychedelics, anti-war protests, and the emerging counterculture that Kerouac saw as a corruption of the original beat vision of personal spiritual seeking. His band, the Fugs, combined crude humor with political activism, exactly the kind of performative rebellion that Kerouac believed cheapened the authentic spiritual quest that had driven the original beats to seek meaning through literature and personal experience rather than group demonstrations. On air, Kerouac loathed him instantly, earning Sanders a spot on his mental list. "Get this faker off my stage," Jack reportedly muttered during commercial breaks, viewing Sanders as a hippie infiltrator. The wild scene unfolded when Kerouac, visibly intoxicated, interrupted Sanders's poetry with rants about communists, at one point yelling, "You hippies destroyed everything," causing host William F. Buckley to intervene as chaos threatened. Jack couldn't stand the long hair and radical politics, a viewer recalled. He saw Sanders as a poser hijacking his movement. Sanders's treatment of conservatives was mockingly dismissive too. He'd lampooned them in satirical songs that Kerouac felt showed the same intellectual arrogance that he despised in political movements of all stripes. What irritated Kerouac was the generational divide. Sanders represented the hypocritical hippies Jack blamed for twisting beat philosophy into anarchy. Despite Sanders's later tribute poems to Kerouac and his genuine appreciation for beat literature, Jack had already written him off as one of the freaks who had corrupted his movement's pure spiritual intentions with political posturing and groupthink. After the show, Kerouac told friends, "That bearded fool's no poet." Gore Vidal, the sharp-tongued aristocrat, Kerouac saw as a backstabbing opportunist. Gore Vidal moved through literary circles with Kerouac, his essays and novels skewering American hypocrisy with surgical precision. Born into American aristocracy, but psychologically wounded by a cold, distant mother and an absent father, Vidal's privileged upbringing masked deep emotional wounds that he covered with wit and intellectual superiority. His aristocratic background and Ivy League education represented everything Kerouac resented about American literary culture. The sense that true art should emerge from struggle and authentic experience rather than from privileged intellectualism and social connections. Kerouac's disdain stemmed from a rumored 1950s encounter. Vidal claimed they'd been romantically involved, which Jack denied vehemently, fueling long-lasting resentment. "He's a liar, chasing notoriety," Kerouac griped in his journals. A wild story emerged from a boozy New York party where Kerouac confronted Vidal, slurring accusations of fabrication, nearly escalating to physical confrontation before friends separated them. Jack's Catholic guilt boiled over, an attendee said. Vidal's snide comments about the Beats as unwashed and his dismissive attitude toward their spiritual seeking added fuel to Kerouac's resentment. Here was a man who had everything handed to him, mocking those who had genuinely suffered and sought meaning through hardship. Despite Vidal's later civil rights, advocacy, and progressive politics, Kerouac viewed him as fundamentally exploitative, a wealthy intellectual slumming with bohemians for material while maintaining his sense of superiority over them. They avoided each other thereafter. Charles Bukowski, the gritty outsider, Kerouac labeled a bitter hack. Charles Bukowski's raw alcoholic tales mirrored Kerouac's, but mutual dislike festered between them. Born in Germany and raised in Los Angeles, Bukowski endured horrific childhood abuse from his father, who beat him regularly and created the cynical, misanthropic worldview that would define his writing. Yet this shared experience of childhood trauma didn't create kinship with Kerouac, but rather competition. Where Kerouac sought transcendence through suffering, Bukowski wallowed in it, creating what Jack saw as literature without redemption or spiritual seeking, just endless cycles of drinking, womanizing, and complaining without any attempt at growth or enlightenment. Kerouac reportedly called him a drinker without vision in letters, resenting Bukowski's dismissal of beats as pretentious. A wild anecdote emerged from a 1960s reading where Bukowski heckled a Kerouac admirer, prompting Jack's retort via mail, "That hack's no brother." Bukowski reciprocated the disdain, calling Kerouac overrated and accusing him of romanticizing experiences that were actually just self-destructive behavior, dressed up as spiritual seeking. What galled Jack was Bukowski's lack of spiritual quest. Unlike the Beats, who saw their suffering as a path to enlightenment, Bukowski seemed to revel in degradation for its own sake, writing about bar fights and hangovers without any attempt to find meaning or transcendence in the experience. The fundamental difference was philosophical. Where Kerouac believed art should elevate and inspire, Bukowski embraced a nihilistic realism that Jack found spiritually bankrupt. He writes like a man who's given up on God, Kerouac once observed to a friend. That's not literature, that's surrender. Their paths rarely crossed, but animosity lingered through mutual literary circles. Timothy Leary, the psychedelic guru Kerouac called a mind-poisoning fraud. Timothy Leary's turn-on-tune-in, drop-out mantra clashed with Kerouac's alcohol-fueled mysticism. Born into an Irish Catholic family and educated at prestigious institutions, Leary's transformation from Harvard psychology professor to psychedelic evangelist represented everything Kerouac distrusted about intellectuals who commodified spiritual experiences for mass consumption. Kerouac despised him as a hippie enabler, once ranting, "Leary's turning kids into zombies." A shocking moment occurred when Kerouac tried LSD once at Leary's urging in 1961, expecting a spiritual breakthrough, but instead experiencing terrifying hallucinations that convinced him Leary was poisoning minds, with artificial transcendence that mocked genuine religious experience. The trip was a disaster. Jack saw demons and felt his Catholic soul being torn apart by what he perceived as evil forces, leading him to conclude that psychedelic substances were tools of spiritual destruction rather than enlightenment. What irritated Jack most was Leary's commercialization and popularization of what should have been private, sacred experiences, turning mysticism into a mass movement complete with slogans and media appearances that cheapened genuine spiritual seeking. Leary's academic credentials and smooth media presence also galled Kerouac, who saw him as another privileged intellectual, exploiting working-class spiritual hunger for personal fame and profit. What irked Jack was Leary's commercialization of enlightenment. They met briefly, but Kerouac shunned him thereafter, warning friends that the professor was leading young people astray. Abbie Hoffman, the yippie agitator Kerouac viewed as a chaotic clown. Abbie Hoffman's theatrical protests embodied what Kerouac hated in hippies. Born into a middle-class Jewish family in Massachusetts, Hoffman's transformation from psychology student to radical activist represented the politicization of personal rebellion that Kerouac saw as a corruption of the Beat generation's purely spiritual and artistic aims. Kerouac called him a clown destroying America in interviews, seeing Hoffman's theatrical protests as attention-seeking behavior that mocked genuine social concern and turned serious issues into media spectacles. A mad tale unfolded during the 1968 Chicago riots when Kerouac watched TV coverage of Hoffman's yippie antics with growing rage, cursing him as a communist stooge who was turning legitimate protest into carnival acts that discredited real dissent. What burned Jack most was Hoffman's mockery of American patriotism. While Kerouac maintained a complex love for his country despite its flaws, Hoffman seemed to hate everything American, which Jack saw as juvenile and destructive rather than genuinely revolutionary. Hoffman's background as a psychology major particularly irritated Kerouac, who suspected that the yippie leader was manipulating crowds using clinical knowledge rather than genuine conviction. "He's treating America like a lab rat," Jack complained to friends. "It's not revolution, it's a psychology experiment." The generational gap between them was stark. Hoffman represented the privileged college kids who could afford to play revolutionary games, while Kerouac came from genuine working-class struggle and saw Hoffman's antics as disrespectful to those who had truly suffered. No direct clash occurred, but the ideological war between them symbolized the broader split between authentic seekers and political performers. Subscribe now if you want more untold stories from the Beat Generation and Golden Age Hollywood. Norman Mailer, the macho provocateur Kerouac, deemed a literary prize fighter. Norman Mailer's pugilistic prose rivaled Kerouac's, but egos collided spectacularly. A World War II veteran turned novelist, Mailer's combination of literary ambition and physical aggression, including his infamous attack on his wife Adele and various public brawls, represented a masculinity that Kerouac found both fascinating and repulsive. Kerouac griped that Mailer was all bluster, no soul, seeing him as a writer who used violence and controversy to mask a lack of genuine spiritual depth or artistic vision. A crazy incident unfolded at a 1950s party where Mailer challenged Kerouac to arm wrestle, ending in a draw, but generating bitter words about literary authenticity that revealed both men's insecurity about their place in American letters. The arm wrestling match became legendary in literary circles, with witnesses describing how both men strained and sweated while trading insults about each other's work, neither willing to concede defeat until they finally collapsed in mutual exhaustion. What annoyed Jack most was Mailer's shameless self-promotion and media manipulation, turning literature into a kind of performance art where the writer's personality mattered more than the actual writing, which Kerouac saw as the destruction of authentic artistic expression. Mailer's Harvard education and Brooklyn Jewish background also created class tensions with Kerouac's working-class Catholic identity, leading to mutual accusations of inauthenticity and posturing. The rivalry intensified when both men competed for similar literary territory, the American male experience, violence, and social rebellion, but approached it from completely different philosophical angles that made meaningful dialogue impossible. They sparred verbally thereafter, with Mailer dismissing Kerouac as a sentimental Catholic, while Jack called Norman a literary prize fighter who forgot to learn how to write. Lucian Carr, the troubled muse Kerouac saw as a reckless betrayer. Lucian Carr introduced Kerouac to the Beats, but his 1944 stabbing of David Cameron haunted their friendship forever. Born into a wealthy St. Louis family, Carr possessed the charismatic intelligence that drew the early Beats together, but his charm masked a volatile temperament that would lead to tragedy and forever alter the group's dynamics. Kerouac helped dispose of the weapon after Carr fatally wounded his older admirer, David Cameron, spending the night drinking and disposing of evidence before Jack was arrested as an accessory, an experience that traumatized him and made him feel complicit in violence he never wanted to be part of. "He's someone who dragged me down," Jack confided to close friends years later. The insane night unfolded when, after the fatal encounter, they buried the weapon in the Hudson River and went drinking as if nothing had happened, with Jack caught between loyalty to his friend and horror at the violence, ultimately leading to his arrest and a brief jail stay that he would resent for the rest of his life. The weapon disposal became a recurring nightmare for Kerouac, who would wake up in cold sweats, remembering the weight of the bloody blade and the sound it made hitting the river bottom. What galled Kerouac most was Carr's post-prison normalcy, He went on to work at United Press International and live a respectable middle-class life while Jack struggled with alcoholism and never escaped the shadow of that night's violence. Carr's ability to compartmentalize the violence and move on with his life struck Kerouac as psychopathic, leading him to wonder if he had ever truly known his friend at all. The final betrayal came when Carr distanced himself from the Beats as they gained fame, treating his role in their origin story as an embarrassing youthful indiscretion rather than the foundational trauma that had shaped them all. Their bond frayed as Jack realized that some sins can never be forgiven, even by those who help cover them up. Neal Cassady, the mad driver who fueled Kerouac's frenzied road. Neal Cassady inspired On the Road's Dean Moriarty, his manic energy propelling epic cross-country journeys. Born in Denver in 1926, Cassady grew up with an alcoholic, homeless father who dragged him through the city's Skid Row, teaching him survival skills, but also creating the restless, desperate energy that would both inspire and exhaust his friends. By age 21, Cassady claimed to have stolen over 500 cars, spending much of his youth in reform schools and jails. Developing the hyperkinetic personality and street wisdom that fascinated intellectuals like Kerouac and Ginsberg, who had never experienced such raw survival. A wild moment occurred during their 1949 Hudson Dash across America, with Cassady stripping naked while driving 100 miles per hour and screaming poetry into the desert wind. Pure chaos that embodied everything Kerouac loved about breaking free from conventional society. Despite numerous affairs, abandonments of wives and children, and reckless behavior that hurt everyone around him, Cassady's fundamental loyalty to his friends and his genuine spiritual seeking shone through his destructiveness. Kerouac watched Cassady's 1968 passing from an apparent overdose in Mexico with genuine heartbreak, knowing he had lost not just a friend, but the living embodiment of the road itself. The pure energy that had made everything possible, but ultimately consumed its vessel. Kerouac watched his 1968 passing heartbroken, saying, "Yeah, Neal was the spark that lit my fire." William S. Burroughs, the junkie sage who turned torment into text. William S. Burroughs's Naked Lunch shocked readers with substance-fueled surrealism. Born into a wealthy St. Louis family that founded the Burroughs Adding Machine Company, Bill's privileged upbringing masked deep psychological darkness that manifested in childhood cruelty to animals and an early fascination with violence and mortality. The most haunting tragedy of Burroughs's life occurred in 1951 when he accidentally shot his wife, Joan Vollmer, through the head during a drunken game of William Tell in Mexico City, an accident that destroyed him psychologically and convinced him that an ugly spirit had possessed him to commit the act. A crazy story emerged from Burroughs's improvised routines, spontaneous storytelling sessions filled with surreal imagery and substance-induced visions, which sparked Kerouac's own experiments with spontaneous prose during their time together in Tangier, amid opium hazes and hashish dreams. Despite personal feuds over money, substance abuse, and creative differences, Burroughs served as a mentor to Jack, introducing him to literature, philosophy, and alternate states of consciousness that expanded Kerouac's artistic vision beyond his Catholic upbringing. Kerouac admired Burroughs's ability to transform his personal demons, addiction, violence, romantic obsession, and Guilt Over Joan's Fate into groundbreaking literature that pushed the boundaries of what writing could express and accomplish. Kerouac admired his grit, noting, "Bill's demons made him a prophet." Carolyn Cassady, the steadfast muse who anchored beat storms. Carolyn Cassady balanced Neil's madness, her memoir revealing the human toll of beat excess. Born Carolyn Robinson and educated at Bennington College, as an art student and theater designer, she possessed the intelligence and stability that both Neil Cassady and Jack Kerouac desperately needed but could never fully accept or maintain. The complex love triangle between Carolyn, Neil, and Jack created intense emotional bonds, but also devastating pain. Carolyn loved both men, but was married to Neil, while Jack was torn between his devotion to both of them and his inability to commit to domestic life. A tender madness unfolded during Jack's passionate affair with Carolyn in the early 1950s, conducted while living in their house and documented in love poems he wrote her, representing his closest approach to conventional happiness, but also his deepest betrayal of his best friend Neil. Her extraordinary strength and patience held the chaotic beat circle together through arrests, addictions, infidelities, and mental breakdowns, providing a stable home base that allowed their creative experiments while absorbing the emotional damage they inflicted on everyone around them. Kerouac confided his deepest fears and hopes to Carolyn, seeing her as both the feminine wisdom he craved and the domestic stability that terrified him because it threatened his identity as a wandering seeker on the road. Kerouac confided in her, saying, "You're the calm in our crazy sea." Kenneth Rexroth, the elder poet who savaged Kerouac in print. Kenneth Rexroth was the elder statesman of the San Francisco poetry scene, a learned anarchist and classical scholar who became one of Jack Kerouac's most vicious public critics. Born in 1905, Rexroth survived a traumatic childhood marked by his parents' early passing, leaving him orphaned and self-educated by age 13, creating both intellectual independence and deep resentment toward those he perceived as privileged or inauthentic. Despite his own bohemian lifestyle and radical politics, Rexroth developed an elitist contempt for what he saw as the beat's intellectual shallowness and cultural appropriation. What made Rexroth particularly dangerous to Kerouac was his position as poetry reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle and New York Times, giving him a powerful platform to destroy reputations with withering prose. In his devastating 1959 New York Times review of Mexico City Blues, Rexroth wrote that Kerouac was a Columbia freshman who went to a party in the village 20 years ago and got lost, dismissing Jack's Buddhism as a dime store incense burner, and comparing him to waxwork figures in old rubberneck dives in Chinatown. Rexroth's reviews systematically attacked everything Kerouac held dear: his spiritual seeking, his jazz-inspired prose, his understanding of African American culture, with the clinical precision of a literary surgeon performing a public execution. The cruelest cut was Rexroth's assertion that Kerouac knew nothing about jazz and Negroes, and that his attitude toward black culture was racism in reverse, shared only by members of the Ku Klux Klan. What galled Kerouac most was that Rexroth had initially been supportive, helping organize the famous six-gallery reading where Ginsberg first performed Howl, but then turned against the Beats when they achieved mainstream success he felt they didn't deserve. Rexroth's personal life was marked by bitter divorces and feuds with younger poets who surpassed his fame creating a pattern of mentoring followed by savage betrayal that left Jack feeling like just another victim of the older poet's jealousy and spite. Friends reported that Kerouac would become visibly agitated whenever Rexroth's name was mentioned, calling him a bitter old man who destroys what he can't create. If you're fascinated by the hidden drama behind literary legends, hit that like button and let's uncover more secrets together. John Clellon Holmes, the literary rival, who beat Jack to publication. John Clellon Holmes occupied a unique position on Kerouac's Blacklist as both intimate friend and literary competitor, whose success with Go in 1952 preceded and overshadowed Jack's own breakthrough. Born in 1926 to a middle-class family, Holmes shared Kerouac's Columbia University background, but possessed the social connections and conventional literary sensibilities that Jack both envied and despised. Holmes's novel Go was the first published beat novel, appearing 5 years before On the Road, and depicted the same circle of friends through a more traditional narrative structure that critics found easier to appreciate than Kerouac's experimental, spontaneous prose. The painful irony was that Holmes received a substantial publisher's advance and critical acclaim for essentially the same material that publishers had been rejecting from Kerouac for years, creating deep resentment about literary politics and timing. What particularly burned Jack was Holmes's more detached, analytical approach to their shared experiences. Where Kerouac poured his soul onto the page, Holmes maintained an observer's distance that felt like betrayal to someone who believed art should be lived rather than studied. Holmes also coined the term Beat Generation in his famous 1952 New York Times Magazine article, "This is the Beat Generation," claiming credit for naming the movement that Kerouac felt he had created through his lived experience rather than his journalistic analysis. In Go, Holmes depicted Kerouac as Jean Pasternak in ways that Jack found unflattering and voyeuristic, feeling exploited by someone who had been granted intimate access to his life and friendships only to transform them into literary material for personal gain. Friends noted that Kerouac eventually worked through his resentment toward Holmes, but never fully forgave what he saw as literary opportunism, taking the raw material of authentic experience and packaging it for mainstream consumption without having truly lived it. Holmes's later success as a respected literary critic and academic only deepened Jack's sense that some writers were rewarded for analyzing the beat experience, while those who had actually lived it remained marginalized and misunderstood. The relationship embodied Kerouac's broader frustration with a literary establishment that valued conventional craft over authentic experience. Gary Snyder, the Zen scholar who made Jack feel like a spiritual pretender. Gary Snyder appeared in Kerouac's The Dharma Bums as the idealized Buddhist seeker Jaffe Ryder, but their real relationship soured as Jack came to resent Gary's authentic spiritual accomplishments. Born in 1930 and raised in the Pacific Northwest, Snyder combined serious academic study of Asian languages and religions with genuine wilderness experience and Zen practice that made Kerouac's own Buddhist dabbling seem superficial by comparison. Unlike Jack's emotional, Catholic-influenced approach to Buddhism, Snyder pursued rigorous traditional training, eventually spending years in Japanese Zen monasteries, studying under authentic masters, achievements that highlighted Kerouac's own spiritual tourism. What initially attracted Kerouac to Snyder His combination of intellectual sophistication and outdoors competence eventually became a source of deep insecurity, as Jack realized he could never match Gary's genuine knowledge or disciplined practice. Snyder's growing environmental activism and political engagement also clashed with Kerouac's increasingly conservative politics, particularly his support for the Vietnam War that Gary actively opposed through both Buddhist principles and ecological concerns. Friends reported that Jack became increasingly bitter about being depicted as Snyder's spiritual student in the Dharma Bums, feeling that Gary had used their friendship to establish himself as the authentic voice of American Buddhism while reducing Jack to the role of enthusiastic but shallow follower. Snyder's legitimate scholarly credentials, his translations of Chinese poetry, his academic positions, his recognition in both literary and Buddhist circles, stood in stark contrast to Kerouac's autodidactic spiritual seeking and made Jack feel like an intellectual fraud. The final break came when Snyder achieved the kind of sustained spiritual practice and cultural integration that Kerouac had always dreamed of but could never maintain due to his alcoholism, Catholic guilt, and inability to commit fully to any single path. In his later years, Kerouac would refer to Snyder as that pretentious mountain climber and dismiss environmental Buddhism as fake Oriental garbage for college kids, revealing his deep resentment towards someone who had achieved the authentic spiritual life Jack had always sought but never attained. The relationship represented Jack's painful recognition that some people actually lived the enlightened existence he could only write about. Joyce Johnson, the literary girlfriend who exposed his emotional limitations. Joyce Johnson entered Kerouac's life in 1957 as a promising young writer herself, but their intense relationship revealed Jack's fundamental inability to sustain intimate connections with intelligent, independent women. Born Joyce Glassman in 1935 to middle-class Jewish parents, she possessed the literary ambition and emotional maturity that both attracted and terrified Kerouac. Joyce was present during Jack's moment of greatest triumph. She was with him when the New York Times review made On the Road famous overnight, but also witnessed his inability to handle success or commit to their relationship, despite their obvious compatibility. What placed Joyce on Jack's internal blacklist was her refusal to remain a minor character in his drama. She had her own literary career, her own needs for independence, and her own perspective on their relationship that challenged his self-centered worldview. Her later memoir, Minor Characters, 1983, provided an insider's account of beat culture that was both loving and devastatingly honest about the men she had known, including passages that revealed Kerouac's emotional immaturity and fear of genuine intimacy. Jack resented Joyce's ability to analyze their relationship with the same literary skill he brought to his own work, feeling exposed and diminished by her clear-eyed assessment of his romantic failures and spiritual pretensions. The painful truth was that Joyce represented everything Jack claimed to want: intelligence, creativity, emotional depth, and genuine love. But he repeatedly chose the road over domesticity, abandoning her for adventures that ultimately brought him only loneliness and disappointment. Their breakup followed the typical Kerouac pattern of creating intimacy through intense, shared experiences, then fleeing when real commitment was required, leaving Joyce to pursue her own successful literary career, while Jack spiraled deeper into alcoholism and isolation. In Minor Characters, Joyce wrote with devastating insight about the women who loved beat men. We were minor characters then, no matter what we thought we knew or how we knew it. The story wasn't about us. This perspective challenged the entire male-centered narrative of the beat generation that Jack had helped create. Years later, Kerouac would dismiss Joyce and other ex-girlfriends as women who used me for material, revealing his inability to recognize his own exploitation of relationships or acknowledge the legitimate grievances of those he had abandoned. Joyce represented the road not taken, the possibility of sustained love and creative partnership that Jack's restless nature and emotional limitations made impossible to achieve. Leroy Jones / Amiri Baraka, the radical poet who rejected white bohemia. Leroy Jones, later Amiri Baraka, initially moved within beat circles as a promising young black poet, but his evolution into radical black nationalism put him on a collision course with Kerouac's increasingly conservative politics. Born in 1934 to middle-class parents in Newark, Jones possessed the intellectual sophistication and cultural authenticity that made him a bridge between the predominantly white beat scene and emerging black arts movements. Jones's early work appeared in beat publications, and he married Hetty Cohen, a white Jewish woman who helped edit the influential magazine Eugene, making him seem like a natural part of the integrated bohemian community that beats claimed to represent. However, as the civil rights movement intensified and black power emerged, Jones began questioning the racial dynamics of beat culture, particularly white writers like Kerouac, who claimed to understand and represent black experience without acknowledging their own privilege. The transformation from Leroy Jones to Amiri Baraka in the mid-1960s represented exactly the kind of political radicalization that Kerouac had come to despise, viewing it as betrayal of the apolitical spiritual seeking that he believed defined authentic beat experience. Jones / Baraka's founding of the black arts movement explicitly rejected the integrated bohemian ideal that Kerouac romanticized, instead calling for black cultural separation and artistic self-determination that excluded white participation or interpretation. What particularly galled Jack was Baraka's critique of white beat appropriation of black culture. The same jazz and street wisdom that Kerouac had built his literary reputation on was now being reclaimed as exclusively black cultural property that whites had no right to exploit. Baraka's poetry became increasingly militant and anti-white, including lines that explicitly attacked the kind of racial tourism that critics had always accused Kerouac of practicing in his portrayals of black characters and jazz culture. The final insult came when Baraka achieved the kind of sustained political influence and cultural leadership that the Beats had always claimed to seek but never accomplished, building institutions, inspiring movements, and actually changing society, rather than just writing about personal experiences. By the time of Kerouac's passing in 1969, Baraka represented everything Jack had come to hate about the directions American culture was taking: racial separatism, political militancy, and the rejection of individual spiritual seeking in favor of collective action and identity politics. The relationship embodied Kerouac's inability to understand how his own racial attitudes and cultural appropriation had contributed to the very social problems he claimed to transcend through literary art. Share this video with anyone who loves literary history. They need to hear these shocking Beat generation secrets. What Kerouac's Blacklist reveals about the Beat era's true chaos. Jack Kerouac's grievances with these 17 complex souls, 12 despised enemies, and 5 tragic anchors offer a raw glimpse into the Beat movement's dark underbelly, beyond the romantic mythology. Jack saw the illusions crumble, shared a Lowell confidant. His judgments carry weight because he birthed the era, yet tried to disown its mutations. With no agenda but honesty, Kerouac's candor exposed hypocrisies. He tolerated wildness, but not betrayal of the pure quest. Later revelations, like Ginsberg's politics, Capote's snobbery, validate his intuition. Before the internet, icons hid their flaws. Kerouac's insights remind us rebels were human, their madness inspiring yet destructive. The man who taught America to seek freedom on the open road couldn't find peace with the very people who shared his journey. Jack Kerouac's Blacklist reveals that even our greatest literary rebels were haunted by jealousy, betrayal, and the weight of their own contradictions. If this glimpse into the Beat generation's secret feuds fascinated you, hit subscribe, because the real stories behind our cultural heroes are always more complicated than the myths